Welcome to the Constructionist Podcast, hosted by Caleb. Just as we grow gardens and build buildings, God is building you through the renewing of your mind. The sufficiency of the scriptures is paramount in your journey, and every week, Caleb will challenge you to make them a central part of your life and worldview. Join us now as we explore the world through the ancient lens of God's Word.
Hello friends, and welcome back to the Constructionist Podcast. What we're going to be doing now is a book review. Now, this book review is going to be on this particular one here. If you're watching by video, it's called Modern Times by Paul Johnson. And it's sort of part of a series that I've been going through, a personal series, and I would encourage you to be challenged to do the same thing. But it's a series of books that are considered the most influential books of the 20th century, nonfiction books, the most influential nonfiction books of the 20th century. Now, several podcasts back, I did a review of C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. So that book is actually number 7 on the list of 100 most influential books of the 20th century. So this is Paul Johnson's Modern Times. I don't recall what number it is on the list, but the reason why I wanted to read it first is because it's called Modern Times, The World from the 20s to the 90s. So he basically covers the history, and really is the history of the world. It's he discusses Asia, Africa, Europe, America, and he goes from essentially the end of World War I all the way through until the early 90s. So the original version, I think, ended in the 80s, and then about, 7 or 10 years later, he sort of revised and updated it and took it up into the 90s. I was a little bit disappointed when I looked into Paul Johnson and found out that he actually died in, I want to say 2012, that he didn't actually bring it all the way up to the 20th century, or the 21st century, that he actually finished out the century. He didn't do that. But he did leave an interesting comment in the very last paragraph of the book, which I will get to shortly. So this particular edition of Paul Johnson's work, Modern Times, is the HarperCollins publishers. I guess it was published in 1991, and so in effect it goes from 1919, or the events around World War I and immediately after, up until 1991. So it does mention, if I remember correctly, Bill Clinton. He gets up into environmentalism and some of these more modern issues that we're still talking about today. But it's a whirlwind of a book. It really does cover a vast array of people and subjects. But what I mostly want to focus on is chapter 1, which is called The Relativistic World. And so that sets the premise for what his primary themes are throughout the book. So even though it's called The World from the 20s to the 90s, it's really a book challenging the ideas of a man-centered government or a man-centered society. So let me make a few comments from chapter 1 of this book. By the way, it's 700 pages, so it's not a minuscule work. Let me just look quickly. Oh yeah, it's pushing at 800 pages of actually written text, not including footnotes. So it's not a minuscule work at all. It is a massive piece of literature. So if you want a really good bird's eye view of the 20th century, this is the book. One of the top books you should probably read. And again, the reason why I decided to go through this list of the most influential nonfiction books of the 20th century, 100 most influential, is because I wanted to partially challenge myself, but also to learn about the last century in order to understand where we are today better. And in one sense, that's really what this book helps us to understand. It gives details about mindsets and philosophies that developed as a result of essentially the rejection of God. And he does make that a theme throughout the book, not necessarily explicitly, but it does pop up over and over again. So he says here in chapter 1 that the modern world began on 29 May of 1919 when photographs of a solar eclipse taken on the island of Principe off West Africa and at Sobral in Brazil confirmed the truth of a new theory of the universe. So he automatically kicks off with an event that was intended to prove or disprove Einstein's general theory of relativity. Now, he calls that the start of the modern world. So let's think about what the world was like briefly before 1919. Up until 1919, you very much had, well, first of all, this is right in the midst of what is considered modernism. So we live in an era now that we could call postmodernism, or even, there's another term for it, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. But modernism is generally considered an era of Western history from about 1770, 1780 up until about 1980, 1990, something like that. So Modern Times is really a book that deals with the final historical events of the modern era. But he says that the modern world began in 1919, on 29 of May, 1919. Now, the reason why he says that is because he's suggesting that Einstein's theory of relativity creates a massive shift in the thinking of society from something that was static, or I shouldn't say static, it was concrete and evidential based on Newtonian physics. And then Einstein came along and said that, well, actually, time and space and matter are relative to gravity, or time is relative to gravity. Light bends, gravity affects things. And so he was very adamant that his theory of relativity needed to be very clearly proven in experiments that could disprove it. So this sort of harkens to the Karl Popper's view of scientific method needing to be falsifiable. So Karl Popper takes the view that when you do experimentation to prove a theory, you're not out to see if the theory works, you're out to see where the theory does not work. And so the least number of times you could see that it works in an experiment to make it not work, then it's closer and closer to being a good, solid, maybe even universal theory that can be applied in all circumstances or whatever. So Popper deals with the idea of not truthification or provability, but falsifiability. And that's really what Einstein wanted to have happen. He wanted to make sure that the experiment clearly demonstrated that his position was, or his theory was correct in its description of E equals mc squared, or what matter and time and light all work together. And even after that moment on the 29th of May 1919, it doesn't necessarily absolutely convince Einstein. He still thinks that it needs to be tested again and again in order to make sure that it really is accurate. So this is very important because Einstein was coming from a period where he held to absolute truth from a moral perspective. So he says here in, let me see if I can read a statement. Einstein and relativity, let me read. Okay, so Einstein developed a theory of relativity, but was unhappy that society then subjectivized it or made it subjectable, which in the end was relativized morality. So Johnson talks about this on page 5. He says here, the emergence of Einstein as a world figure in 1919 is a striking illustration of the dual impact of great scientific innovators on mankind. They change our perception of the physical world and increase our mastery of it, but they also change our ideas. The second effect is often more radical than the first. The scientific genius impinges on humanity, for good or ill, far more than any statesman or warlord. Galileo's empiricism created the ferment of natural philosophy in the 17th century, which adumbrated the scientific and industrial revolutions. Newtonian physics formed the framework of the 18th century Enlightenment and so helped to bring modern nationalism and revolutionary politics to birth. Darwin's notion of the survival of the fittest was a key element both in the Marxist concept of class warfare and of the racial philosophies which shaped Hitlerism. So, too, the public response to Einstein's relativity was one of the principal formative influences on the course of 20th century history. It formed a knife inadvertently wielded by its author to help cut society adrift from its traditional moorings in the faith and morals of Judeo-Christian culture. So this is what he means. This is what Johnson means by a relativistic world. So he takes Einstein's word, relativity, and he does what society seemed to have done at the time and turned it into a freedom from mores or from morality, a freedom from the requirements to be bound by a specific lifestyle or a specific way of living. In other words, it made all things relative. Now, he argues that Einstein himself did not like that Einstein himself believed that there was absolute truth and that morality needed to be adhered to in order for society to be stable. Now, we discussed this in C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man in one of our previous podcasts, so I would recommend going back and listening to that, because Lewis saw exactly this, that if you eliminate high reason, I can put it that way, I guess, high reason or morality or ethics, if you make those things relative, then or non-concrete, then what you end up doing is you open up the door to conditioners who can come in and condition society based on their desperation to have power over people, and everybody else becomes a pawn under the illusion that they're actually given freedom. Now, Lewis actually does talk about this in light of science and in light of certain scientific advancements. So he talks about the wireless or the radio or the means by which people can get quick and fast information. We may call that today media or social media or smartphones or push notifications or whatever. He also talks about contraception, C.S. Lewis, in this idea that to have the power to control who should be born in the next generation. And then he also, there's a third thing he talks about, the airplane as well, with freedom of travel, freedom of movement around the world, gives us a sense that we have a kind of power over our environment or whatever. Now, when you read that, it's hard, at least for me, it was hard not to make that argument apply directly to our modern technology. I firmly think that cell phones and the rise of the personal computer and iPads and things like this have actually changed the way we think and perceive the world around us. So just as Lewis says, think about it in light of something like your smartphone. You think that you have freedom of information, freedom to get certain facts and figures, freedom of communication, freedom of social networking, all through your phone. But there is a sense that we have now found that people who are involved in the development of Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, these sort of platforms that create media or they propagate content that is used then to change the way people think about other people and about society at large. And it comes out in things like MAGA or the woke agenda or whatever, that it polarizes people into very firmly held camps because their device is only feeding them the things that they really want to see. And so there's never any challenge or any pushback into any other way of thinking about things, and so there's no balance. Everything becomes lopsided into your camp or into your pre-decided mindset. So this is where Johnson is correct, and this principle that he's bringing out still plays true today. So just like he said here, the scientific genius impinges on humanity for good or ill far more than any statesman or warlord. Galileo's empiricism, Newton's physics, Darwinian concepts of the survival of the fittest, which brought about Marxism and class warfare and racial philosophies, which shaped Hitlerism. Now, we still are subjected to racial philosophies today. This is true of Black Lives Matter and things like this. And so Einstein's idea of relativity, even though he wanted it to stay strictly related to his position on a particular scientific way of viewing planetary motion and light and gravity, has actually been somehow taken and used to allow people to reject ethics and morality and things like that. I did a series of podcasts several years back on the book Seven Men Who Ruled the World from the Grave. And so it talks about Darwin, it talks about Freud, it talks about, these seven guys. And but one of the people that he wrote about, the author, I forget his name right now, was Einstein. He had a whole chapter on Einstein and Einstein's theory of relativity having a unintended effect on society. And he actually got sort of springboards off of Johnson's book here and the comments that he makes, and then elaborates on them as a sort of eighth person that unintendedly rules the world from the grave, because Einstein didn't mean for his theory of relativity to be used in an ethical or moral sense, although it seems like that's what happened. So the next person that sort of opens up the modern world for us, as Johnson describes it in chapter 1, is Freud. So he says on page 6 of his book that Freud was not a scientist, but a great artist. So this is an interesting idea. What's the difference between a scientist and an artist? So I have a master's degree in hermeneutics, which can be defined as the art and science of interpretation. Now, interpretation itself is a very large subject that can be applied to any your perception or your understanding of any media. And also you can boil it down to hermeneutics is about how is it that we actually do understand something or anything for that matter. So it's looking at something objective out there and then applying it or trying to understand it for yourself to get the fullest sense back out of the thing that you're looking at, whatever it is. So, reading this book, I read/listened on Audible to the book, and it's not like I understand necessarily every single thing in it, but I gained enough out of it that I can certainly talk about it intelligently to you. So understanding and knowledge and go have a relationship with each other. But I'm deviating now, but artist and science. So he says here, Freud was not a scientist, but a great artist. So my degree that says the hermeneutics is the art and science of interpretation. So how do you balance these two things? So art is something that must have certain rules that govern it. So rules of light, rules of texture, rules of palette, color palette, if we're talking about painting or color drawing or sketching or something like that. Let's say you're doing a comic strip and it's in black and white, and so you have to have ways of delivering the idea of motion or facial expression and things like this. So motion and emotion, these kind of things. but it's art. And so you can take a character or a concept and you can make a collage out of it. You can go a little abstract. You can be a realist. You can be an impressionist. You can be any number of things. Architecture is a form of art. Poetry is a form of art. But it's the art and science of interpretation. And so what are the rules behind that govern the art that keep it in check? And then in what way can the art sort of push the boundaries of the rules or operate within the freedom that the rules give to a degree to come up with something new and creative and different and fresh and interesting? So this is this constant tension. So he says here, though, that Freud was not a scientist, but a great artist. So he's implying then that we can get rid of the scientific nature of what Freud was trying to say and focus on the artistic side of what Freud was trying to say. Now, that then means that we have problems with Freud. So Freud was an interesting chap. Not a scientist, but an artist. He held that those who disagreed with him were unstable and in need of treatment. So he says this on page 6, and it actually is an interesting idea. Freud betrayed signs, in fact, of the 20th century messianic ideologue at his worst. Let me read that again. Freud betrayed signs of the 20th century messianic ideologue at his worst, namely, a persistent tendency to regard those who diverged from him as themselves unstable and in need of treatment. Now, he puts Freud in the category of 20th century messianic ideologue. So what would be a messianic ideologue? Someone who's a messianic, not to confuse this with Jesus as the Messiah in the Jewish scriptural sense, but just the broad concept of messianic. This would be someone who believes that what they are presenting is that which can bring salvation to humanity. Okay? So someone who's got a messianic complex. I remember reading a number of years back about Bono from U2, and I want to say he described himself as someone with a messiah complex. So in other words, he feels like he has that which society needs in order to become better or to be saved or whatever. Now, to be fair, I mean, I've listened to U2 music for a number of years now, over 20 years. And there's a lot of good things that you could say about U2's music, but I would disagree with some of his philosophy and ideology as well. Although one thing that I do appreciate about Bono, the lead singer of U2, is that he does get out and do the dirty work. So he, after the famous Live Aid concert in the 1980s, where they played at Live Aid with Queen and other bands, and it was all to raise money for what was happening in Ethiopia at the time. Bono and his wife Ali actually did go to Ethiopia or Kenya, Tanzania, one of those countries that was being afflicted, and he spent 6 weeks there, and they were involved in a camp, and he did it without any press. Nobody went with him. I imagine the guys in the band knew that he was going, but he kept it a secret because he wanted to see what was really happening on the ground. And then when he started his charity work to try to eliminate malaria in Africa, he does a TED Talk on this subject. And he goes and he gets information from people who are experts on the subject of malaria and third world issues and things like that. And he wants to talk to people from both sides of the spectrum of opinion in that matter. So I do credit him for the effort that he put into it. But the idea of a 20th century messianic ideologue, if Freud had this idea, it would appear from what Johnson is now saying, that his teachings were that which would save humanity. Now, let's talk about just one aspect of this. Johnson delves into this idea of guilt. So the Freudian analysis of guilt, the personal conscience, In the Freudian analysis, the personal conscience which stood at the very heart of the Judeo-Christian ethic and was the principal engine of individualistic achievement, was dismissed as a mere safety device. So Freud dismisses personal conscience, is what Johnson is here saying. This was dismissed as a mere safety device collectively created to protect civilized order from the fearful aggressions of human beings. So the conscience is there to protect people. Now, I've always defined conscience as that inside of you that is a little red flag that goes off to let you know if something is right or wrong. It's involved in your spirit. It's something about your spirit is your conscience. It's a deep portion of you that functions suddenly, and it could be trained, it could be seared, it could be weighed down heavily. The conscience is something that we can clearly see functioning within us, and it needs to be there. And Scripture, even the Judeo-Christian ethic, as he's talking about, the New Testament Scriptures actually talk about the need for the blood of Jesus Christ, the God-man who gave of himself to bring humanity up to a likeness of God that we can't achieve on our own. That is the only thing that can really cleanse our conscience, is what it says in Hebrews. So Freud is dismissing this whole idea. He dismisses it. Freudianism was many things, but if it had an essence, it was the description of guilt. This tension between the harsh superego and the ego that is subjected to it. Now, this is a quote from Freud in 1920. This is what Freud himself wrote. The tension between the harsh superego and the ego that is subjected to it is called by us a sense of guilt. So the sense of guilt is the tension between the superego and the ego. Civilization, Freud says, obtains mastery over the individual's dangerous desire for aggression by weakening and disarming it, and by setting up an agency within him to watch over it, like a garrison in a conquered city. So that's his quote. Then Johnson here goes on to say, feelings of guilt were thus a sign, not of vice, thus a sign not of vice, but of virtue. Feelings of guilt were thus a sign not of vice, but of virtue. So this is bad when guilt becomes a virtuous thing, because ultimately guilt is that which lets us know that we are in the wrong about something and need to put that something right. So it's very legal. It's about wronging somebody and having to make it correct. So on the grand scale, if you rob a bank or commit murder or abuse somebody, then your conscience should kick in and give you a feeling, a sense of guilt. And that happens when something, and then it reminds you that you had done something wrong, and that wrong needs to be made right. And so this is what often happens in, say, a trial of a murderer or something like that, and they describe the way the person was in the court, and that they were cold, or they showed no pity whatsoever. Their conscience was seared, is what it was. They don't think that they were actually wrong. I actually went and visited a man once in jail who had been arrested for child pornography, and was actually housing underage girls in his home. And I knew him. He lived near us. It was a shock to me and everybody in our community what had actually happened, that this guy was doing this, because he knew a lot of people and he was well liked in the community. But he was there in jail, and he was telling me how other people were, more guilty than him, and I can tell you who was doing this and doing that. He was denying the guilt that was very clearly put upon him. And it's made me realize over the years, and I've seen this happen quite a lot, that people are determined to self-justify. And when they self-justify, they do it in order to try to make themselves right. So that's the idea of justification, is to try to get yourself aligned correctly to something. And so people will try to do that. If they are clearly in the wrong on something, the flesh, the self-preservation sense kicks in, and it tries to make someone else out worse than you so that it takes the attention off of you. Now, this is not a good thing. And when it starts to become a virtue, as Freud explains it, then it really begins to mess up society. And so this is the second person in Johnson's three people, and technically four, he throws another one in at the very end of this chapter, that have affected the way we think and made it a relativistic world that we are now living in. So Einstein and a misunderstanding of society on what relativity actually is. Freud not being a scientist but a great artist, and believing that if you disagreed with him, then you were the one in the wrong and you need therapy. Now, the Soviet government did this kind of thing with anybody that disagreed with them. They threw them into re-education camps. I've read about this in Eastern Europe. I've read about this in China. They put people who disagree with them into, quote, re-education prisons, with the expectation that if we beat them, they will then change their mind and see that we were right all along about everything. And so automatically the person in the wrong is the person who disagrees is the one who is in the wrong. And this is not a healthy mindset to have, but it is something that has been passed on to society in some ways. It's happened in the counseling and psychiatry industry, where the Bible explains that homosexuality is an unnatural relationship to have, sexual relationship to have, and yet the psychology world went and created this term called a homophobe. So now a homophobe is a person who disagrees with the homosexual lifestyle. He's now the one labeled as being in the wrong, whereas for decades and decades and centuries, it was illegal to be a homosexual because that was considered an inappropriate relationship to have with another individual. And so this kind of ideology, it crops up. And so Freud felt like that's what he had, was a way of saving humanity. But has it really? Has society actually gotten better since Freud's ideas have spread through? Now, the third person we need to look at is Marx. Karl Marx was the founder of the communist ideology. He lived in the 1800s. He didn't make it into the 1900s, I don't think. If he did, he didn't make it to World War I. So he would have died before Freud and Einstein were around. But his ideas very much have an impact today. So Marx's version of historicism focuses on economic factors to discern the laws of history in order to predict the future. So one of the things that pops up often in Johnson's modern times is different people's eschaton or eschatology. Hitler's eschatology, Marx's eschatology. And eschatology is a study of the end times. So Marx, he had his historicism, and when I say historicism, I'm defining that as he took a concept and tried to understand all of history through this one concept. And for Marx, it was economics. So if we can understand the laws of history and from an economic perspective, how does the economy function in the laws of history, then we can then predict where history is going. So this is what Johnson says about this idea. He says, and this is actually a quote from Marx himself. Marx had pronounced, quote, "The final pattern of economic relationships as seen on the surface is very different from, and indeed quite the reverse of, their inner but concealed essential pattern." So let me read that again. So this is very much an historicist way of viewing history from a particular perspective, and his perspective is economic. So he says, Marx wrote, the final pattern would be the eschatology, what will happen in the end, of economic relationships as seen on the surface is very different from, and indeed quite the reverse of, the inner but concealed essential pattern. Now, what he's saying here about the inner and concealed essential pattern is related to a Gnosticism. So Marx is claiming that he was able to see deeper into the laws of history as viewed through the economy than anybody else could, and that he was able to explain that in such a way that we could predict or manipulate history according to the laws that were there, i.e. through economic means. So hence, we got to get rid of all classes. We have to have, Marxism. You have to get rid of all classes, and then that means that you have to divvy up property to everybody. Everybody owns everything, and so all things are communal, blah, blah, blah. It kind of goes on like that. Now, it didn't work. And in no country where communism has been applied has it worked. Russia, I grew up during the Cold War, heard a lot about Russia, have been to Russia myself a couple times. It collapsed in the late 80s, early 90s. Cuba has ceased to work. China is a communist country by government ideology, but they're basically capitalistic with heavy government control from an economic perspective. So they're not pure in that sense of economy. North Korea turned into a personality cult under the Kim family. So these countries that have tried to adopt communism, it's never worked in any of these countries. And so because you're focusing on one small thing, which is economics, and trying to control all of society from an economic perspective. So it doesn't really work. But it also speaks to a kind of Gnosticism. Marx believed he saw something deeper. Freud believed he saw something deeper. But these things just don't make practical sense. They don't work out in a practical way. Now let's go to the end of the chapter, which is pretty long, actually. Let me keep flipping. Page 43, page 50, 53, 59. Whoops, I went too far. Let's back up a bit. Here we go. Page 48. This is the end of chapter 1. So, the rise of the modern times that Johnson talks about, he relates it directly to the decline of the church. Now, when I say church, I mean from a historical perspective, the decline of the Roman Catholic Church, which happened in the 1800s, the donation of Constantine and the bequeathal of huge amounts of land to the papal estates all got taken away from the Pope and from the Catholic Church in the 1860s into the 70s. So Vatican I was an attempt in the 1870s, I believe, was an attempt for the Vatican to try to hang on to some kind of power, and so they lost much of their land, which means they lost a lot of their economy and that kind of thing. The rise of Darwinism, of the origins of life on Earth that happened through natural processes means that people didn't necessarily need to have a belief in a God or a higher power, and so that diminished much of the church's authority, especially when they were adopting those views and basically reinterpreting scripture along the lines of Darwinian thought. So that diminished the authority of the church in the West as well. And so these things lessened the power of the church. But what takes its place? It can't be a vacuum. Something has to take its place. And so what takes its place is politicians and philosophers, and intellectuals, which are modern day philosophers anyway. So people like Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, people like Bertrand Russell, people like Jean Sartre. These people ended up becoming the intelligentsia of our modern age. Hemingway. They then, Karl Marx, another one who, the founder of communism, these guys then took over the field and said, hey, we've got what it takes, this messianic ideologue, we've got what it takes to make society function. We don't need the church. All we need is our own intellect. And I've produced a system. So that being the case, we've got a big problem. So it says here that, I'm trying to find this statement that Johnson talks about, the millions of people that have died under the government. It's in the hundreds of millions in the 20th century alone. Hundreds of millions of people have died as a result of government action. So that's certainly true in China. If you look at like the sparrow famine that happened, I think it was called the sparrow famine. That was a government-directed attack on sparrows because they were eating grain, and so everybody went around killing sparrows. But as a result, there was a infestation of grasshoppers that ate everything anyway, and so then you had famine and millions of people died. You've also got like Hitler is an example, and certainly communist Russia. These people, the Gulag Archipelago, that'll be one of our future book reviews. These kind of things were ways of eliminating a huge number of people. I mean, obviously we recognize things like the Holocaust and the people that died in it. But in other countries as well, the killing fields of Burma, there's different places where there's been a huge number of people that have died as a result of government attempts to get power. And the problem with this is that it's humans doing this to humans. So after Einstein, after Marx, after Freud, then the last person in chapter 1 of A Relativistic World that Johnson brings up is Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, the third of the trio, was also an atheist, but he saw God not as an invention, but as a casualty, and his demise as, in some important sense, an historical event, which would have dramatic consequences. This is what Johnson says. So Nietzsche coined the phrase, God is dead, and then immediately after that, he says, and we killed him. So this is where Nietzsche stands. He stands on this idea that as humans, humanity is operating without God, or we're functioning atheists, even though we placate the idea that there is a God. So Nietzsche wrote in 1886, Johnson quotes, "The greatest event of recent times, that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God is no longer tenable, is beginning to cast its first shadows over Europe." So he said this in 1886. And one of his primary themes, Nietzsche's primary themes, is this idea of the will to power. So let me read this from Johnson. Nietzsche rightly perceived that the most likely candidate would be what he called the will to power. So he says that the history of modern times is of how the vacuum has been filled. So God's gone, so that means, well, the church doesn't matter anymore. Popes and vicars and priests and pastors, whatever, we don't care about them. So what's left? We have to have something else. We have to have the will to power, is what Nietzsche says, which offered, Johnson wrote, a far more comprehensive and, in the end, more plausible explanation of human behavior than either Marx or Freud. In place of religious belief, there would be secular ideology. Those who had once filled the ranks of the totalitarian clergy, would become totalitarian politicians. And above all, the will to power would produce a new kind of Messiah, uninhibited by any religious sanctions whatever, and with an unappeased appetite for controlling mankind. The end of the old order, with an unguided world adrift in a relativistic universe, was a summons to such gangster statesmen to emerge that they were not slow to make their appearance. He calls them gangster statesmen. Now that's a pretty potent ending to chapter 1. of the relativistic world. So let's see what Johnson says at the very end, and then we'll wrap up. So skip to page 783, and Johnson says, by the 1990s, state action had been responsible for the violent or unnatural deaths of some 125 million people during the century, more perhaps than had succeeded in destroying during the whole human history up to 1900. Its inhuman malevolence had more than kept pace with its growing size and expanding means. So one of the boring bits about this book is his retelling of statistics of money. And there's places where it almost becomes tedious to go through. And you can, if you're not into economics, which I'm not a huge fan of economics, you could probably safely skip that bit. But here's an example. The Russians, hang on, let's back up. The outcome, this is just on page 329. This is absolutely just picking a paragraph out of the middle of the book. The outcome of the war, however, was not determined by great power intervention, which canceled itself out, nor by the non-intervention policy of Britain and France. Since arms could always be obtained for gold or hard currency, the Germans provided a maximum of 10,000 men at one time, including 5,000 in the Condor Legion, an experimental tank and aircraft unit, and suffered 300 killed. And then he talks about pilots, 200 tanks, 600 aircraft, 88mm aircraft guns. This is all in 1937. The Italian contribution was bigger, 40 to 50,000 men at one time. 4,000 were killed, 150 tanks, 660 aircraft, 800 pieces of artillery, some of high quality. Rifles, machine guns, supplies. They claimed and shot down 903 aircraft, sunk 72,800 tons of Republic shipping. Anyway, you can see what I mean. So, but all of that takes a huge amount of government organization. You have to have big government for these kind of things to happen. So the argument that Johnson is making is that by the 1990s, various political states were responsible either directly or indirectly with 125 million deaths during the century. So this is really, really staggering numbers, and one that we should take very careful care to think about the future, which Johnson does. Johnson says here, this is the very last paragraph of the book. All right, Johnson says here in the very last paragraph, certainly by the last decade of the century. So he's talking about the 1990s. Now, this was published in 1991. So he's hopeful. He ends hopefully. By the last decade of the century, some lessons had plainly been learned, but it was not yet clear whether the underlying evils which had made possible its catastrophic failures and tragedies, and then he lists them: the rise of moral relativism, the decline of personal responsibility, the repudiation of Judeo-Christian values, not least the arrogant belief that men and women could solve all the mysteries of the universe by their own unaided intellects, were in the process of being eradicated. What is this true? Are they in the process of being eradicated? On that would depend the chances of the 21st century becoming, by contrast, an age of hope for mankind. Now, I am recording this in 2025. So we are 1/4 of the way through the 21st century. And is it, by contrast, an age of hope for mankind? That's an interesting question. And it's one that made me ponder as well when I got to the end of this 780 plus page book, that the theme throughout is moral relativism. It is a rejection of Judeo-Christian values as canonized in the scriptures. Where has it gotten us since 1919? Where has it actually gotten us? So I would challenge you to read through this book and talk about it and share it with other people. The one reason why I'm reading the most influential books of the 20th century is because they have been forgotten. And now here we are 25 years after the 20th century, and it seems to me like much of what Johnson wrote is extremely relevant. I would also recommend a sister book to this one by Johnson called Intellectuals. And that one is actually a bit depressing because he talks about the men and some of the women who have helped structure the thinking processes of the 20th century, the so-called intellectuals, and what kind of people they were. So on one hand, they are elevated as great modern thinkers, but on the other hand, look at their life and see what their life actually does demonstrate. Are these people that we want to emulate or not? So that's your challenge. So I hope you've enjoyed this review of Modern Times. I thoroughly enjoyed it, found it very challenging, and so it's the second book review in our series on the most influential books of the 20th century. So grab a copy of this, get a copy of C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.